Good morning, good day, good evening, and I'm wishing you a warm welcome to our IHRM webinar series. My name is Maja Vidovic. I'm a professor of human resource management at RIT Croatia, and I have the honor of being the moderator for today's webinar. Given that this webinar series has been running for well over 3 years now, I'm guessing the majority of you already knows this was a direct result of a COVID lockdown back in 2020 that went into history as the largest work from home experiment in the world. This webinar was originally ideated as a collaboration of an amazing group of people that I'm hugely proud to have been working with during these 3 years now. Specifically, I'm talking about Mila Lazarova from Simon Fraser University in Canada, Elaine Farndale from Penn State in the US. Then we have Maral Muradbekova and Marion Festing, both at ESCP Business School in Europe, one of them in France, one in Germany. We have Miguel Olivas from Penn West in the US, and myself. I'm from RIT Croatia, which is the global campus of RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, from Rochester in New York. And the global campus is located right here, my hometown, Zagreb in Croatia. The recordings for all of our previous webinars are hosted at our YouTube channel. The links should be appearing in chat any moment now. And then based on the number of views of those recordings, I'm guessing these are being regularly visited. For today's webinar, we have a pleasure of hosting my dear friend, Andrei Georgiadou, as our speaker. The title of today's webinar is Global Strategies, Local Connections, Navigating Gender Diversity Management. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speaker. So Dr. Andrei Georgiadou, she's the Director of External Engagement, the Director of the CIPD Accredited Master of Science in Human Resource Management and Organization, and an Associate Professor in the Nottingham University Business School. Dr. Georgiadou's expertise centers around equality, diversity, inclusion at work, and she focuses on relational and interdisciplinary perspective. Hence today's topic. Dr. Georgiadou is an associate editor of Gender Work and Organization, and also the review editor of International Studies of Management and Organization. Also, she's a member of a number of British Standards Institution and International Organization for Standardization committees, including the Gender Equality and the International Human Resource Management ones. Her research has been published in leading peer-reviewed journals, which includes Human Resource Management Journal, Gender Work and Organization, and European Management Review, among others. Dr. Georgiadou has also contributed to numerous book chapters. She actively collaborates with a wide range of organizations, providing support to achieve sustainable results in enhancing inclusion within the hybrid workplace. Additionally, she's the founder of the Equality, Inclusion, Diversity Center, a non-governmental organization dedicated to advancing inclusion and diversity. A lot of work being done. I'm not sure if Dr. Georgiadou ever sleeps, but for sure, a huge amount of effort and dedication and drive behind these topics. So before we dive into this topic, please be aware that chat has been disabled for the attendees, but instead, please use the Q&A option to post any questions, thoughts, or reflections that you might have during today's event. We will have time after the talk to address those, so feel free to help us navigate the discussion. I'll be picking up your questions and hopefully going through those towards the end of the event. And just another reminder, you came here for the inspiration, new perspective to tackle the curiosity you might have. So sit back comfortably in your chairs, take a deep breath, put all other thoughts and topics on pause, and just enjoy today's event. And Andrei, thank you once again for so much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maya, for the wonderful introduction. It's group effort. You cannot talk about inclusion and look into inclusion and actually try to enhance inclusion efforts if you're not part of a fantastic team. And I'm very lucky to be actually part of such a team. So thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Also, thank you to your amazing team for the kind invitation to participate in this webinar series which I have to confess, I absolutely love. So it's really a privilege for me to be here today. So thank you so much. Um, I will also like to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the session where we will be looking into some contextual factors that have an impact on gender diversity management. And our talk will be, our discussion will be centered around a paper that I co-authored with Professor Jawad Syed, and it was published in Human Resource Management Journal. So when we talk about gender diversity management addresses issues related to women's equality in the workplace. So when we talk about gender diversity management, we have to remember that this is closely tied to the societal framework in which it operates. So what that means is that both institutional factors like policies, laws, regulations related to family, regulations related to work life, but also social factors like education and employment. All those factors can influence how organizations approach gender diversity. And that includes initiatives like diversity committees and inclusive leadership. And what we've seen is that while there has been extensive research on gender diversity and inclusive organizational approaches in Western, and we could argue mostly individualistic contexts, non-Western perspectives on gender diversity management have been limited, with a few exceptions, of course. Now, research on informal social networks within organizations highlights the importance of traits like gender as the basis for forming and identifying and establishing these networks. So for example, the way people interact at work, that can be affected by whether women are seen as token representatives rather than being integral parts of the employee population. So access to these informal social networks is critical because as employees, we rely on the practical resources like support, like guidance, but also emotional support that actually are provided by the network members. So not having access to these networks can be a significant reason for the underrepresentation of women in the workplace, especially when we talk about senior positions. And as scholars, we have paid much less attention to how gender diversity is managed in collective settings, where such informal social networks play a very significant role. And that's evident particularly in East Asia. So in this paper, we are trying to understand, well, we're trying to send the message actually to emphasize that the way organizations in East Asian countries handle gender diversity is influenced not only by the policies, right, but also by broader social factors. And when we talk about social factors, that includes access to informal networks. And that links with the question we see on the slide, whether there is a one-size-fits-all approach to gender diversity management that actually works. And there's no straightforward answer, of course, but what we are seeing in this paper, or the way we're trying to answer it, is by emphasizing that context matters. And there is a lack of research on women's participation in such information, in such informal networks. And we don't know the challenges that they face when they try to join such networks and gain acceptance within these networks. We've seen through research how people are naturally prefer to socialize and work with and collaborate with those who are similar to them. So along with the potential existence of somehow exclusionary practices in these networks, this preference for similar individuals or for similarities in individuals and groups could create barriers to accessing such informal networks, and that in turn can hinder career advancement opportunities for those that are outside the established network. So in this article, what we're trying to do is we try to provide the East Asian perspective on managing gender diversity. And we do so by emphasizing the significant role of informal social networks. The networks which actually influence the way institutional mechanisms impact the organization's approach to gender diversity. And the approach we take to informal social networks is as these being, the personal and professional connections that individuals create, and they seek to create these networks in order to achieve either personal or organizational goals. And we introduce them as opposed to formal networks like state institutions or religious. It's important to note here that informal networks are crucial for women's success in any cultural context, obviously not limited to East Asia. And the reason for that is gender inequalities is a global concern, of course. However, our focus in this paper is on the East Asian context, mainly because of its unique contextual, experiences that could shape informal social networks differently for East Asian women compared to East Asian men or Western women or Western men. Also, the comparatively less formal nature of East Asian societies, and also the hierarchical aspects of Confucianism. Given those, we try to emphasize the significance of informal social networks in East Asia for gender diversity management compared to the West. Of course, having said that, this is a call for further research on other types of informal social networks as well, because that would be interesting to see how they have an impact on gender diversity management in different contexts. We also examined in this paper how informal social networks actually play a role in both the broader societal and organizational aspects of diversity, like social attitudes and laws, and how this in turn impact organizational practices and approaches related to gender diversity management. So our premise in this paper is that these informal social networks actually serve as key mediators, in a way shaping the impact of institutional mechanisms at the societal level or on diversity practices within organizations. So while institutions influence structures and influence the outcomes, networks are the one who actually define the types and orders that facilitate the establishment of institutions, and it's networks which actually contribute to their effectiveness. So we argue here that in order to fully understand how organizations approach gender diversity management, one must consider the role of informal social networks, but also vice versa. So within this context, we argue that individuals tend to form social connections with those who are similar to them. And that can result, for example, in male employees identifying with and forming informal social relationships with each other, potentially excluding and therefore marginalizing women. Now, Bourdieu defined social capital as the total resources stemming from having a network of lasting relationships that are characterized by recognition and mutual acquaintance. Now, these relationships are often somewhat institutionalized, relying on recognition from an institution. Simply put, social capital arises from a network of people who share observable qualities and also have some more permanent elements in common, like same certification or similar educational background. Bourdieu highlights how social capital plays a role in transferring resources, but also transferring power within or between those social groups. So access to the social capital, which, as we said, entails, encompasses resources that are tied to that specific group membership, that access is frequently a privilege enjoyed by the dominant group in society. So when looking at the broader, at the societal level, it's very important to consider the conditions that can actually affect various forms of discrimination and exclusion, conditions like cultural conditions or institutional conditions. This level involves fundamental circumstances like values, like, for example, how society understands and embraces and interprets aspects like education, like family, like work. All of these factors could either hinder or enhance equal opportunities for individuals. And it's very important to remember and to recognize that at this point that individuals do not just interact, right? They are the ones who create environments that can actually impact career progression and can actually impact policymaking. So workplace opportunities and workplace barriers as well are always influenced by contextual factors, especially for organizations nowadays who operate in diverse societies to begin with. So factors like, legal frameworks, cultural factors, and various mechanisms shape how organizations approach gender diversity management. So, for example, an example we gave before, diversity committees, or affirmative action plans. All those structures play a very important role in increasing women's representation in upper management. However, when we talk about social capital, again, that is deeply rooted in people's social relationships. And it's something that at the same time is used by individuals. And it's all about, when we talk about social capital, it's all about the trust. It's all about norms. It's all about networks. So social capital is a resource that individuals or groups either possess or they lack. Now, collaboration is more straightforward in a community that is rich in social capital, because that emerges from collective actions by the members of the community. So it's all about, establishing the networks. Then in order for that network to work effectively, you establish some rules and you engage in collaborative efforts to achieve whatever shared goals or objectives you have. This form of capital includes all the resources that are tied to those groups or those individuals or the networks. And as we said, they are characterized by trust, by reciprocity, and by commonly accepted rules of behavior and patterns of behavior. From this standpoint, social capital becomes a resource for collective action. Collective action that has an impact both at the broader societal, but also the organizational environment. So we could say that it acts like a force, a very solid force that binds communities and societies together. So in this paper, we view social capital as the accumulation of informal social capital. And we argue that that can either promote effective gender diversity management within the context that we described, or it can hinder that. Now, an organization's approach to managing gender diversity reflects its underlying beliefs and its attitudes towards diverse groups and individuals. So in simple terms, it shows how the organization feels about and how the organization treats people from different backgrounds. Now, this approach is essentially, is talking about the quality of social relationships within the organization. And this is what we just described as social capital. So it's about how well people trust each other, how well they work together, whether they share common goals, and all these contribute to achieving better results as a team. One crucial aspect now of social capital is that sense of belonging within the organization. When members of a social network feel like they belong, then they're more likely to cooperate effectively. And it's these qualities, this belongingness, this cooperation, this participation that are very key to building a strong bond among in-group members. And trust plays a fundamental role in this whole process. When there is trust, people are more likely to cooperate and reciprocate, and that actually forms the foundation for creating value within the team, within the group, within the organization. So this notion of social capital is very closely related to the concept of trust. When there's trust in an organization and the social networks, that contributes to the creation of social capital, because as we said, social capital is about those relationships and those ways that people work together under shared agreed rules and patterns of behavior, and they're motivated in a way that they will work together towards achieving those common goals. So taking this idea further, in this paper, we suggest that an organization's approach to enhancing or hindering that sense of belonging within the workforce is what actually informs the decisions regarding gender diversity management. So in other words, how the organization treats gender diversity is influenced by the informal dynamics at play. So when we talk about social network, we talk about personal interactions. We talk about various aspects of those interactions and how these affect behavior or knowledge exchange or resource exchange within teams and organizations. So organizational culture, which is socially constructed, that is influenced by those social ties that connect individuals. So that has an impact on their behavior. So participation in these networks within organizations can provide practical support, they can provide emotional support, that sense of shared identity within the organization. From a stakeholder perspective, organizations are expected to protect and support the individuals, the employees' need for belonging and care, both inside and outside the organization. So this suggests that the broader social environment actually influences those organizational practices that are related to gender diversity management. And they're influenced exactly through the effect on access to and the usefulness of those networks. So what we're saying here is that formal institutional mechanisms and approaches influence organizational approaches to gender diversity management. But this influence is actually mediated by informal social networks. So organizations are more likely to adopt a gender diverse approach, and in their values and in their norms, when informal social networks align with those aspirations and those priorities and those values. Now, moving forward, I will be focusing more on giving some examples on informal social networks in East Asia. Professor Horak, in his work and during his webinar, actually, some time ago, highlighted how comparative studies on social capital and social networking theories have primarily originated from Western scholars, and that they focus more on Western social contexts and structures. So in this paper, we try to broaden this perspective and look into social networks in other parts of the world, and we start with East Asia. So for example, we start with China and Guangxi, which refers to personalized social and emotional connections between people. Now, these connections can be based on family ties or other forms of mutual benefit and shared interests. In Chinese culture, establishing the right Guangxi is considered crucial for a successful career and business success. and that's the case because it helps individuals become part of that in-group, of the inner circle. Of course, a downside of guanxi is that it can create distinctions between those within the inner circle and those outside of it, potentially limiting opportunities for the latter, including women. Informal social networks are essential in shaping women's experience in organizations, exactly because they include various relationships like access to mentorship, advice, social support. So they play a very important role in women's career advancement. Now, at a broader societal level, despite the fact that China has introduced legislation that promotes equal opportunities and gender equality in the workforce, women report experiencing job discrimination. And networking strategies are critical and crucial in this context because the concept exactly of guanxi plays a significant role in forming those connections. So in this very hierarchical culture, supervisors, who are often male, hold that power and access to the resources and act as gatekeepers to networking opportunities. So women being considered as members of outgroup, they face challenges in accessing those networks, and that results in limited information, that results in limited knowledge exchange, so that results in not having opportunities for career progression. A similar case with South Korea, where strong personal connections are often formed through shared educational experiences or regional ties, and they play a very important role in business, and they're deeply rooted in emotions. Now, these connections, they include relationships that were forged in high school or university, but also they refer to sentimental bonds with people maybe from the same area, from the same village, from the same town. Younger ties are valuable in various contexts. Contexts like, when trying to access specific information, to secure employment, or having access to promotion opportunities, but also enjoying preferential treatment. And of course, they have a dark side, sometimes associated with favoritism. So they follow a very strict hierarchy, and that what that means is that juniors are expected to oblige when seniors, for example, ask for favors. So that's the context. So again, despite the introduction of legislation promoting gender equality, the macro level gender hesitance in South Korea has a significant impact on the career progression of women. We've seen in this research how women invest in job-specific training, and yet they have fewer opportunities to attend that, especially training that has to do with global competencies and strategic planning, because these are very important. If you want to go for a senior role, you have to attend those, or if you're aiming for long-term promotions. And they're not given these opportunities because those opportunities are usually granted based on those younger ties. So what do we have there? So we have women struggling to find, mentors compared to men, right? And what's the disadvantage on women here is that mentoring is essential for career development. So being considered outsider deprives them of those opportunities. So they don't get access to that work-related guidance, and that imposes hierarchical constraints. So within this culture, women face difficulties in forming social connections also with other professional women. So it's very difficult to access male-dominated younger networks. Another form of gender discrimination that we've came across with is a practice where often employees gather for post-work meals and drinks. Well, that practice often, forces women into attending gatherings where, they feel pressure to participate in drinking and in activities, um, which potentially could have a negative impact on their health and their well-being, because maybe they don't like attending, for example, those gatherings. So these limited networking opportunities hinder career advancement for women, and that reduces their chances for promotions, for mentoring, for skill development. Lastly, we use Japan as an example as well, where personal connections hold a critical role in the realms of business, politics, various aspects of social life. These personal connections are, we could say, the cornerstone that underpins many interactions in Japanese society, whether that is professional or social. What was really interesting here to find is that the term on diversity management that is used in Japanese has non-Japanese origins. So it's not officially recognized in the Japanese language. So that raises the question of whether diversity in Japan was imported without sufficient adaptation to its unique cultural context. So again, we see that despite equal opportunity laws enacted, their implementation remains satisfactory. So could that gap be explained by not considering the context? Something to reflect on. So the introduction of laws that aim for that gender equality has not translated into an equitable representation of women in managerial positions. So these, the consequences of this glass ceiling for women in Japan are profound, because, they struggle to achieve equality. So that leads to a greater need to actually belong to networks that could support them and provide them opportunities for mentoring and guidance within the workplace. So our research highlights the significant impact of informal social networks on gender diversity management approaches. We could say that, these networks actually serve as a bridge, a critical bridge that connects the broader cultural and legal norms that are present in society with all those specific policies and practices and approaches, taken and established within organizations. So in essence, we could say that informal social networks actually act as a channel, transmitting the societal expectations and values regarding gender diversity to the workplace. Now, in the context of East Asia, our research goes even further, and we try to provide insights into the gender-specific nature and the implications of those informal networks. Now, in this specific in this specific region, informal social networks are deeply embedded in the society. So they have unique characteristics that actually influence how gender diversity is managed. Of course, for some, or in one aspect of these networks, we could actually argue that they could be beneficial and influential, but of course they have a downside, because they tend to create divisions. They separate individuals into in-groups and out-groups. And it's that division that can be detrimental, especially for members of out-groups. For example, token males compared to underrepresented women in senior management roles. In East Asian organizations, informal social networks actually could favor male employees over their female colleagues, making it more challenging for women to access the same career advancement opportunities. So I guess this situation raises concerns about how both organizations and individuals perceive and how do they respond to these differences within the workplace. So I guess it challenges us to consider how gender diversity is understood and how gender diversity is valued. It's crucial to recognize that and remind ourselves that, people bring their unique social identities to the workplace. And it's those identities that influence their experiences and creates their opportunities as well. So it's not sufficient to categorize individuals randomly to predefined groups. We need to acknowledge their distinct experiences and their backgrounds. So our research underscores that informal social networks actually, as I said before, they serve as channels for values, societal expectations that are related to gender diversity into the workplace. They can be advantages, but they also can perpetuate inequalities. So that actually calls for a more nuanced understanding of how individuals experience their social identities and how gender diversity is managed within organization. And that calls for effective communication channels to be in place in organizations, so for those identities to be expressed and acknowledged and celebrated. In localized settings, organizations often find themselves under pressure to follow established structures and practices within those informal social networks. And of course, that pressure could lead to the adoption of approaches that are exclusive by design, and they favor certain individuals over others. Some of this exclusionary behavior, we might argue that it's intentional, when individuals in positions of power deliberately hinder the progress of others, especially, those from out groups. So this kind of exclusion can be driven by personal motives or, the desire to maintain those existing, power dynamics. Also cultural norms or gender stereotypes that are prevalent at the societal level can influence those processes within the informal networks. So for example, if there is the prevailing belief in a society that specific genders are better suited for specific roles or leadership positions, that can further hinder opportunities for individuals who do not conform to these stereotypes. So our research not only looks into the concept of social capital within informal networks, but we also try to investigate that complicated connection between gender diversity management and these networks. And we recognize that, networks and institutions have a reciprocal and very dynamic relationship. The networks, they're not just isolated social structures, they're deeply linked with the institutions that they operate within. So for example, Guangxi, Yongo, all these are central to everyday life and institutional routines. So they influence various aspects of interactions, social interactions, professional interactions. Also, these kind of traditions have an impact on international business practices, especially in the context of gender diversity management. So understanding that relationship between informal networks, cultural norms, gender stereotypes, their impact on gender diversity management, that is essential. So it's only by acknowledging how these networks operate within the broader social and institutional context that we can actually talk about managing to develop strategies that could effectively promote inclusion and gender diversity within the specific context. Now, in the context of international business, effective communication and negotiation, all these aspects centered around the strength of informal social networks. So for example, lacking an understanding of Guangxi can require the involvement of intermediaries that could actually establish and nurture those kind of relationships. So building and maintaining such relationships are fundamental. And individuals, must appreciate and understand not just cultural nuances, but also leveraging informal networks to forge strong partnerships. Now, in the human resource management realm, it's essential, for example, to acknowledge that women face the challenge of not having access to powerful informal networks compared to their male counterparts. That imbalance can obstruct their career advancement, especially when trying, to break through gender-related barriers like glass ceiling. And we can look into specific examples like mentorship programs. You know, there are organizations that formally establish such initiatives, but their success actually depends heavily on the voluntary and the informal action of mentors. You know, they need to provide guidance, they need to sponsor mentees. The effectiveness of those programs is significantly influenced by the passion of those mentors, but also the diversity within the informal network. So if the enthusiasm is not there or diversity is not there within the network, that can actually disadvantage women, and that can undermine, you know, the program's overall impact. Same with talent development programs. I mean, we have the formal training sessions, but beyond that, it all comes down to that informal sharing of experiences, that insider knowledge or that expertise that could come through these networks. And that's what is actually vital in preparing talent for leadership roles. And again, not having access to those networks, that can hinder the development of talented women. Even when organizations, you know, they have formally egalitarian policies in place, still it's these informal networks that can make or break opportunities for women's career advancement. And we must not underestimate their significance. So essentially what we're saying here is that within organization, there exists an ecosystem. And that could look like a balance between formal guidelines and procedures, intertwined in a very complicated way with informal networks and social connections. And these elements have an impact on how plans are put into action, but also what results they yield as well. So to navigate this ecosystem effectively, we need to understand how these informal networks function in various local contexts. It's not always immediately evident, but we've seen that these networks can act actually as the lifeblood of the organization, because they are the channels through which formal policies and directives take hold, not just within the central organization, but also, you know, across subsidiaries if we're talking about multinational corporations. So the way these networks are structured and how inclusive they are can either foster or hinder the effectiveness of gender diversity management, even, you know, when the formal rules and policies in place appear to be progressive or the right ones. So what's next? As we go forward, you know, move forward in our exploration of factors that influence gender diversity management and its effectiveness, another contextual element that's worth considering is a diverse temporal context. So one crucial aspect within that context is the concept of timeism. And we see timeism as, you know, the practice of evaluating individuals not based on their contributions, but rather on the amount of time they spend working. So that intertwining of time, organizations, and gender, that is an aspect in a very, I would say, a vital aspect in the realm of international human resource management, because time isn't just a clock ticking away. Time is a fundamental element that shapes how we perceive and how we structure our work. And in this intricate landscape, gender actually plays a central role. So consider how individuals distribute their time when it comes to work and their responsibilities at home. You know, gender with its societal expectations and family roles significantly influences this allocation. So how we structure our time is essential for understanding that quest for gender equality at work. And amidst all this, we have informal social networks coming into play. And as we've seen already, these are not just about friendships, right? They mirror traditional gender roles, and they influence how individuals, especially women, manage their time and engage in work-related tasks. So these networks, when inclusive and adaptable to different time constraints, they can be a very powerful force in promoting gender equality. So if we are to talk now about the demanding culture of long hours at work and the the shift from focusing on clock time to a more task-oriented approach. And we know that all these changes have become very common in organizations. However, we have to remind ourselves that, that shift does not just affect work patterns. That has an impact on our health, on well-being, and inclusion. So informal social networks can further influence who is expected to conform to these extended work hours and who is not. So, going back to the concept of timeism essentially prioritize those with more time to dedicate to work, often aligning with traditional masculine stereotypes. Informal social networks can sometimes perpetuate this timeism. So they can marginalize, individuals who don't fit this conventional mold. And the pandemic, I would say the ongoing pandemic, has only made this intricate relationship more complicated, because it changed the way we experience work, and it has reminded us, the need for organizations and for management to be more compassionate, to be more flexible, to be more inclusive. So these approaches must consider the diverse time-related constraints that employees might face. So to tackle these very complex interconnections of time, organizations, and gender, we need an interdisciplinary approach. We need to understand how individuals experience time in organizational settings, how different temporal concepts impact inclusion, how informal social networks can challenge these norms. So I urge you to submit your work to our special issue. The deadline is on the 30th of January. And the call is open to scholars who are interested in looking into exactly the gendered impact of time on inclusion in organizations. So we emphasize here the need to look into how conceptions of time can promote, ensure, or hinder inclusion management in the organization. So we're looking into the interplay between time, gender, and management practices, and looking into how to develop more nuanced and context-specific understandings of those challenges, but also opportunities that arise in further promoting gender diversity and inclusion. So to summarize, it's important to understand the newest dynamics between formal institutions and informal social networks, because that's essential when it comes to shaping gender diversity management efforts, but also the results that they yield. Informal networks assume unique structures in different contexts, and that needs to be considered when developing and implementing any gender diversity initiatives. Timeism, which prioritize the quantity of hours worked over actual productivity. Well, timeism can pose a significant challenge for gender diversity management. Informal social networks have the potential to facilitate or obstruct these efforts, depending on how they're leveraged within the organization. And finally, the intricate relationship between these elements is what underscores the importance of taking a holistic, a comprehensive approach to gender diversity management. So not just addressing formal institutional policies and guidelines, but also appreciating and recognizing the influence of informal networks that exist, and make sure that we take into account the unique characteristics of these networks in different contexts. Thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate the time you've dedicated to our session. So open to hearing your thoughts or any questions you might have regarding this. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Andre, thank you so much. This was really powerfully inspiring, I must say, on my end for sure. Thank you so much for the talk. We do have a little bit of time. I already have a couple of questions lined up, but I'm also going to invite our participants. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A. Even if we do not have the time to answer them right now, perhaps it's a lead for another conversation for connection. But I'd like to stick to the topic of timeism, which is the last topic that you mentioned. And given that we're talking about the whole concept of international, the HRM, this is the kind of the topic of the webinar, just kind of pulling it a little bit outside and asking if you can relate how timeism is relevant for HRM and maybe IHRM. What might be the implications of looking at HRM theory through the lens of using timeism as a concept?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the feedback, but also the question. And yes, we're actually very excited now that we started looking into timeism and the implications, and see how, in fact, it's as if we go back to HRM theory and paradigms and consider this as new lens, and what could be the synergy between various HR paradigms and timeism. So, for example, when we focus, on well-being, right? And taking a more humane-oriented, as I mentioned before, approach. Well, there is there is a very important challenge if we see through the timeism lens, because all too often that involves biased assessment based on perceived time availability within the organization. So we do talk about well-being, but when we talk about, when we consider assessments, aren't those based on perceived time availability? So we need to address that. So what we need is, a shift maybe in how employee performance is evaluated, for example. We need to have this recalibration that emphasize quality and impact over the quantity of time spent at work. And that's been very relevant, especially nowadays. Well, nowadays, over the last couple of years, when we've been working a lot virtually, and we've seen that in organizations as well. So we do try to facilitate remote work, but with those endeavors, we also blur the boundaries between work and personal life. So that constant connectivity, it could actually reinforce timeism. So it could favor those who are readily available. So we need to counter this. So, for example, organizations need more clear guidelines for work hours and a focus on work-life balance and what that means. So I think this is a fantastic opportunity for us to go back and revisit, and reconsider, and, as we say, recontextualize even inclusion on what it actually means in this new workplace. I hope I answered the
was
question.
just also gonna say, yeah, it does, and it opens a new series of questions as well, which is the point. I also want to say that we had a webinar. It was Wolfgang Meyerhofer. He held it back in February this year, and it was on time, right? So
Yes,
the topic was
I saw that. Yes,
time on our side towards more time-sensitive
yeah.
research in IHRM. So if anybody wants to go and revisit that recording, it's all in the YouTube. Another topic that is being raised is that so I'm going to kind of read a base of the question is that your arguments seem to be based on how women in different East Asian countries connect to the already established in-group networks.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question is, have you considered the existence and perhaps development of alternative, complementary, and or even competitive networks in which women could play a different role? And kind of, I'm guessing this is a call for action. And thank
Exactly,
you.
exactly. And thank you so much for that, because just to clarify, that was a conceptual paper. So we introduced the framework. So it's actually a call for us to go back and to go to the field and actually collect some data and see how that fits into the framework we are suggesting, and we are introducing. But ideally, and it's a fantastic suggestion, actually, that there are two levels that we could see, informal social networks being established at, right? So when we talk about guangxi, that comes from the societal level, whereas indeed within the organization, informal social networks can be equally powerful as well. So that will be really interesting to see those power dynamics. That will be actually giving women more opportunities to formulate those networks, and counterpart the fact
Mhm.
that, maybe that exists at the societal level. Well, look, within the organization, we have formed that as well. So I wanted to talk about the power of informal social networks. I have given examples of ones, existing at the societal level, but I think it will be equally interesting and very meaningful to see what happens within the organization informal social networks, and how those can actually work towards promoting gender diversity management if at the societal level things are going in another direction. So that's a fantastic question, and yes, as you said, Maya, a call for action.
A call for action for sure. And I'm
Yeah.
guessing not only in this area that you were talking about, it's a global topic.
Exactly.
I,
It's all about connectedness and belongingness. This is where we're all coming back to. If we figure out the ways to enhance that and promote that, I think that will define the new workplace, because whether we like to admit it or not, the workplace that we are referring to when we talk about the traditional management approaches doesn't exist anymore. So that's a call for us to revisit all those models, considering that we have this new workplace now, and see what could work in this new context.
Mhm. And I think we have. I'm still gonna push it for a couple of questions, although we're kind of close to the end. Um, so we got a comment regarding when you were talking about the social capital analysis. So
Yes.
Stacey Fitzsimmons actually comments that you primarily rely on where was the question? Okay, you
Yeah.
primarily relied on Bourdieuian social capital analysis, but she says I also noted that you use a lot of terminology and mechanisms such as the outgroup discrimination, shared identities, in-group, out-group dynamics, and so on. So she's saying, I'm curious if you've taught about the connections between the social identity theory and social
Mm,
capital analysis for the
mm.
gender diversity management.
I think those will be fantastic um, theoretical approaches to use when we collect data. I think that would be great to
Mhm.
see how these are, come into place. I'm assuming they will help us a lot to understand the dynamics of within the organization in form of social networks. Because I did talk a bit about, people trying to, showing favoritism to people who they understand as being similar to them. So I'm assuming that will play a vital role when we look into those informal social networks within the workplace. So that's a fantastic question. Thank you for that.
And I think the next question is also more of a suggestion for when
Mm-hmm.
the study gets done.
Uh-huh.
So the topic is on just perception of gender diversity with gender divide.
Uh-huh.
So the question is, in your study, do you cover? But I'm guessing it's like when you do the study,
Mm,
and then covering gender diversity in work environment, where either the
mm,
female are on top of organization or industry is more female oriented, like in cosmetics or female garments,
mm.
etc. And do the
Yeah.
gender diversity remain same, or is it a little bit altered? And what
Mm.
happens there with divide?
Yeah, it's I briefly mentioned that in the presentation, how when we talk about effective diversity management approaches, we should never forget the fact that we need to incorporate in that approaches employees' voices, so employees' perceptions of what that looks like. Because all too often there is this gap. I mean, management team tries to do something, they think they're doing great, whereas is not what the employees find meaningful,
Yeah.
or it's not close to their perception, not even close to their perceptions of how diversity management is or should be effective, should be managed in order for them to consider that effective. So it all
Sure.
comes down to bridging that gap. So that's why I'm always trying to emphasize the importance of establishing those communication channels. So for those those voices to be heard and recorded, and actually taking action on those. Because it's that gap that actually has brought us into some approaches not being that effective. So I guess again that's something that we will capture through capturing individuals' perceptions on that. Again, fantastic.
Yeah,
Will I be getting all those fantastic
yes, of course.
questions? Excellent.
Of course, we'll share those with you, and I'm hoping that many more will come based on the discussion. Unfortunately, this is the sad part of my role, where I have to say time is out, and we really need to wrap this up. I have a couple of kind of housekeeping announcements, so please, everybody, stay posted for our next webinar. We're going to be hosting it in December, early December, so it's going to be December 7th, Thursday again. The title this time is going to be Translating IHRM Research for Practical Impact. So we're going to be joined by Professor Günther Stahl from Vienna University of Economics and Business in Austria. I'm looking forward to that one. So that's the first announcement. The second one is keep an eye out for the 6th Global Conference on International HRM, which is for a long time now has been organized by the Center for International HR Studies at Penn State. The conference is going to take place June 13, 14 in 2024. And this is the first time that the conference is going to be hosted in Europe, more specifically in Sweden. So there is a link to the call for papers in the chat, submissions due February 2024. And I have two more things to share. There are two special issues that we'd like to bring your awareness to. One is for the International Journal of Human Resource Management. The topic is Understanding Strategic Human Resource Management in the Context of the Global South. The manuscript deadline is end of February 2024. And the second one that Andre already mentioned for the International Journal of Management Reviews, which is Towards an Integrated Theory of Gender, Time, and Organizations, completely fitting the topic we talked about today. Manuscript deadline for that is 30th of January 2024. And I was speaking very very quickly and hopefully wrapped it up all. Andre, once again, thank you so much. This has really been a very kind of impressive and interesting topic, like raising awareness and spreading the good vibes. Thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for the engagement and discussion. Thank you.
Sure. Everybody have a really great rest of the day, evening, and we'll be seeing you for the next webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.